She had one bullet left, not for her enemy, for herself. After 11 days running through a Montana blizzard, Clara Weston was ready to die rather than let her brother-in-law touch her again. But then she saw a light, a cabin. And inside that cabin stood the most terrifying man she had ever seen. A giant with a scar across his face, a man the whole town called the Devil. He looked at her frozen body and said 5 words that stopped her heart. "I am gonna devour you whole tonight." What he meant by those words will change everything you think you know about monsters and angels, about running and fighting, about love found in the darkest places. This story teaches us that our darkest moments often lead us exactly where we need to be, that the people the world calls monsters are sometimes the ones who save us. And that true strength is not about never falling. It is about finding the courage to trust again after everything has been taken from you. Sometimes we have to lose everything to find what truly matters. Sometimes the storm that nearly kills us is the same storm that brings us home. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear that hope exists even in the coldest winter. And if you want more stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of love, survival, and second chances. Clara had been running for 11 days when she finally accepted she was going to die. Not from the blizzard clawing at her face like a living thing, not from the wolves she had heard howling at dusk. No, she would die from the single bullet she had saved in her father's old Colt revolver. One bullet. For herself. Because Marcus Weston would never touch her again. The snow came down thick and relentless across the Montana Territory. December of 1883 had brought the worst winter in memory. The Absaroka Range had disappeared behind walls of white. The Yellowstone River Valley lay buried beneath endless drifts. And Clara Weston rode through it all on a mare that was dying beneath her. Penny stumbled again. The horse had given everything she had. Clara felt the animal shudder and knew the end was coming. "Please." Clara pressed her frozen face against the mare's neck. "Just a little further, please." But Penny had nothing left. The horse collapsed without warning. Clara tumbled into the snow. She lay there for a moment. The cold seeped through her thin wool coat. The coat she had grabbed when she fled Kansas. The only thing between her and death. She pushed herself up. Penny lay still. The mare's eyes were already glazing over. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered the words into the howling wind. "I'm so sorry." She took her saddlebag. She took the revolver. She left the horse that had saved her life and stumbled forward into the white. The memories came unbidden. Marcus drunk at her bedroom door, his fists pounding the wood, the lock giving way, his hands reaching for her, the oil lamp in her grip, the flame catching his sleeve, his screams, her escape. Clara touched the burn scar on her left wrist. A reminder of that night, a reminder of why she could never go back. She walked, she fell. She walked again. The cold had moved past her feet and into her bones. She could not feel her hands anymore. The single bullet in her revolver seemed more merciful with every passing minute. Then she saw the light, golden and warm, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. A window. A house. Impossible. Miraculous. Clara crawled toward it, her hands and knees scraped against ice and rock. She did not care. That light meant warmth. That light meant life. The cabin materialized from the storm, built of lodgepole pine with smoke curling from its chimney, a barn nearby. A working farm carved from wilderness by someone with more stubbornness than sense. She reached the porch. Her frozen fingers could not form a fist to knock. She slapped her palm against the door. "Once, twice, please." The word came out as barely a whisper. "Please!" The door swung open. Clara fell forward into warmth and muscle and the largest man she had ever seen. He caught her like she weighed nothing. His arms came around her. His voice rumbled questions she could not understand. The heat of the fire somewhere nearby felt like salvation. Then he lifted her, carried her, and her eyes focused enough to see his face. The man was a giant. That was her first thought, breaking through the fog of cold. He stood tall enough to duck through doorways. His shoulders were broad enough to block the firelight behind him. His face was hard-carved and stern, all sharp angles and dark stubble. Storm-gray eyes, a scar running from his left temple to his jawline, pale against weathered skin. He looked like something mothers warned daughters about. But his hands were gentle as he set her in a chair before the fire. His voice was low and careful when he spoke again. "Can you hear me, Mom?" Clara nodded, a jerky motion that made her head swim. The giant knelt before her, those gray eyes level with hers. He pulled off her frozen gloves. His hands were enormous, rough and calloused, but they moved with surprising care as they exposed her ice-white fingers. "Damn," he muttered the word. "You're half frozen. What the hell were you doing out in this?" Clara tried to speak. Her teeth chattered too hard to form words. He worked in silence, chafing her hands between his own, moving to her boots, wrestling them off to reveal feet that were gray and worrying. "Stay here," he ordered, as if she could possibly go anywhere. He disappeared. She heard him moving around the cabin, pots clattering, water splashing. When he returned, he carried a basin of water that steamed gently. "This is going to hurt," he warned. Then he lowered her feet into the water. Clara screamed. The pain was extraordinary. White, hot needles driving into her flesh as circulation returned. She tried to pull away, but his hands held firm. "I know." His voice had something almost like gentleness. "I know it hurts, but you have to endure it. Let the blood come back." She gripped the arms of the chair. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The agony continued. Then gradually it faded into something bearable. The man watched her throughout, those gray eyes never leaving her face. When the worst had passed, he nodded once. "You'll keep your toes," he said. "Could have been worse." Her voice finally returned, rough and cracked. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." He rose to his full, imposing height, looked down at her with an unreadable expression. "You're half dead. Hands like ice, feet worse." He paused. Something shifted in his face, something that might have been dark humor. "Looks like I'm going to devour you whole tonight." Clara's heart stopped. He must have seen the terror flood her face, his brow furrowed. Then understanding dawned. The ghost of something tugged at his mouth. He pointed at the pot bubbling on the stove. "The stew," he clarified. "Made enough for a week. You're going to eat until there's nothing left." He turned toward the kitchen. "What did you think I meant?" Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. "I wasn't thinking clearly. Clearly not." He returned with a bowl, steam rising like a promise. "Eat, sleep. Tomorrow we talk about what drove you into a blizzard in the middle of the night." He moved away. Clara watched him go. This mountain of a man who had pulled her from death's door, who was now ladling stew into a bowl like it was the most natural thing in the world. She should be afraid of him. Everything about him screamed danger, the size, the scar, the isolation. But she was not afraid. She was exhausted, confused, still half frozen. But fear was notably absent. Perhaps she had used up all her fear on Marcus. Perhaps there was none left for anyone else. The giant returned with bread to go with the stew. He watched as she ate. The food was simple but good. Venison and root vegetables in rich broth. Clara was so hungry she did not stop until the bowl was empty. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara. Clara Weston. You got a husband out there, Mrs. Weston. Someone I should look for." "No." The word came too quickly, too forcefully. She saw his eyes narrow. "I'm a widow. There's no one." He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Name's Elijah Stone. This is my land, my house." He gestured toward a door. There's a bedroom through there. You'll take it tonight. He'll sleep by the fire. I can't take your bed. It wasn't a suggestion, Mrs. Weston. You need rest and warmth. That bed is the warmest place in this house. Don't argue with me about it. Clara did not have the strength to argue. The thought of a real bed after weeks of sleeping in barns and under trees was almost enough to make her weep. "Thank you, Mr. Stone," she said softly. "You saved my life tonight. I won't forget that." Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or something older and deeper. Then it was gone. "Get some sleep," he said gruffly. "We'll talk in the morning." Clara rose on unsteady legs, made her way to the bedroom. The room was small but clean, dominated by a large bed covered in quilts that looked homemade. A woman's touch, she thought, and wondered about the story behind that. She climbed into bed fully clothed, pulled the quilts up to her chin. The mattress was soft, the blankets warm. The pillow smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something masculine. She was asleep before she could identify it. Later that night, Clara woke briefly. Through the crack in the door, she could see the firelight, could see the massive shape of Elijah Stone sitting before the flames. In his hands, he held something small, a piece of pink fabric, a child's bonnet. "I'm sorry," she heard him whisper. "I should have been here. I should have—" His voice broke. Clara eased the door shut, her heart hammering. Whatever had happened in this cabin, whatever ghosts haunted Elijah Stone, she had stumbled into something far deeper than a simple farmhouse in a storm. She looked toward the window. Through the frost, she could see nothing but white. The blizzard raged on, and Clara Weston was trapped here, with a giant who held a child's bonnet and wept in the dark. What had she walked into? The quilts smelled of lavender and sorrow. Someone had stitched love into every seam, the patterns intricate, the colors carefully chosen, the work of months or years. Clara traced the fabric with fingers that still ached from frost, wondering what had killed the woman who made them. Because something had. She was certain of that now, something more than time. Morning light streamed through the window. Clara rose slowly, testing her feet. They ached, but they worked. A small miracle. She examined the room in daylight, details that had escaped her the night before. Women's clothes in the wardrobe, untouched, dusty. A child's rocking horse in the corner, handmade, beautiful. An empty ammunition box under the bed. A dark stain on the wooden floor near the door, scrubbed but still visible. Whoever had lived here had not just left. Something had happened. Clara moved to the dresser. A drawer that did not quite close properly caught her attention. Inside she found letters, a locket, and a small leather journal. She should not look. These were not her secrets to uncover. But the journal had fallen open. The last entry was visible, frantic, uneven handwriting. 3 words stood out darker than the rest, pressed so hard into the paper that the page had nearly torn. "They found us." Clara closed the journal quickly, her hands trembling. The smell of coffee drifted from the main room. She took a breath, steadied herself, opened the door. Elijah Stone stood at the stove, his back to her, even larger than she remembered in daylight, his shoulders impossibly broad beneath his flannel shirt, his arms thick with muscle. He moved with surprising grace for a man his size. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's ready. Food will be in a minute. Good morning." Clara moved toward the table where a cup of coffee waited. She wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth. "How did you know I was awake?" "Heard you moving around." He turned then, those gray eyes sweeping over her. "You look better, still too pale, but better." "I feel better. Thank you for everything." He grunted, turned back to the stove. "How are your feet?" "Sore but functional." "Good. Eat something. Then let me take a look at them. Frostbite can be tricky." He brought a plate to the table. Eggs, bacon, thick slices of bread. Set it before her with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he seemed to apply to everything. Clara's stomach growled. "Eat," Elijah said. "You need it." She ate. The food was good, plain but satisfying. She cleaned her plate without shame. When she finished, Elijah took the empty plate, replaced it with more coffee, settled into the chair across from her. "Storm still going," he said. "Won't break for another day at least, maybe two. You're stuck here until then." Clara nodded. She had expected as much. "I'm sorry to impose on you. It's not an imposition. But I think you owe me some answers, Mrs. Weston." His gray eyes met hers, steady and penetrating. "What were you doing out in that storm? Where were you trying to go?" Clara hesitated. She had known this question was coming. Had spent the last few moments deciding how much to tell him. The truth could be dangerous. If Marcus came looking. If Elijah Stone decided he did not want the trouble. But he had saved her life. He had given her his bed and his food, and asked nothing in return. She owed him something. "I was running away," she said finally, "from my late husband's brother. He wants to marry me." I refused. He did not take the refusal well. Elijah's expression did not change. But something dark flickered in his eyes. "Didn't take it well, how?" Clara looked away. He made it clear that my refusal was temporary, that he would change my mind one way or another. She swallowed. I decided not to give him the chance. "Where were you heading?" "Anywhere." I didn't have a destination. I just knew I had to leave. Elijah studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. "Your horse is dead," he said bluntly. "You have no supplies, no proper winter clothing, and from the look of you, you haven't eaten properly in weeks. The next town is 8 miles through mountain terrain. Even after the storm breaks, the snow will be too deep to walk through. You'd be dead before you got halfway." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Then what am I supposed to do? You stay here." The words were flat, brooking no argument. "Until spring, at least. Until the road's clear and you can travel safely." "I can't. That's months away. I can't impose on you for months." "You're not imposing. I have the room. I have the food." He paused. "And no man who would force a woman should get what he wants. If this brother-in-law of yours comes looking, he won't find you here. I don't get visitors." Clara stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. Months of shelter, months of safety, more than she had any right to expect. "Why?" she asked softly. "You don't know me. Why would you do this?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough, like the words were being dragged out against his will. "Because I know what it's like to be alone in the cold," he said. "And because my wife would have helped you. And she's not here to do it herself. His wife." Clara thought of the quilts on the bed, the dust on the dresser, the way he had said my wife would have helped you in the past tense. "I'm sorry," she said, "for your loss." His jaw tightened. It was a long time ago, but not long enough, Clara thought. Not nearly long enough. "It'll work," she said suddenly. "I won't be a burden to you. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I'm not useless. Let me earn my keep." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or reluctant respect. "You don't have to." "I want to. I need to." She met his eyes. "I've spent the last 2 years being treated like a burden, like a problem to be solved. I won't do that again. If I stay here, I work. That's my condition." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "You're giving me conditions now." "I am." She lifted her chin. "Take it or leave it." For a long moment he just looked at her, those storm-gray eyes, unreadable. Then he nodded once. "All right, Mrs. Weston. We have a deal." The first week was an exercise in careful navigation. Elijah Stone was a man of few words and strict routines. He rose before dawn to tend the animals, 2 horses in the barn, a small herd of cattle in the pasture beyond, chickens that seemed perpetually unhappy with the cold. He returned for breakfast, ate in silence, then spent the day working on the tasks that kept a farm running, mending fences, chopping wood, repairing tools. He did not talk to her, not really. He answered her questions with single words or grunts. He avoided being in the same room with her for any length of time. At first, Clara thought she had done something to offend him. Then she realized the truth. Elijah Stone did not know how to be around another person anymore. He had been alone too long. The habits of solitude had calcified around him like armor, and he did not know how to let anyone through. So Clara stopped trying to force conversation. Instead, she simply existed in his space, going about her own tasks with quiet efficiency. She cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, scrubbing away years of bachelor neglect. She mended his clothes, riddled with holes and patches that spoke of a man who could not be bothered with such things. She cooked meals that were more elaborate than his simple fare. She did not ask him about his wife. She did not ask about the scar on his face or why the townspeople apparently feared him. She just worked, waited, let him get used to her presence. It took 8 days before he spoke to her unprompted. She was kneading bread dough at the table, her sleeves rolled up, flour dusted across her forearms. He came in from the cold, hung his coat by the door, moved toward the fire. But instead of settling into his usual chair, he paused. "That smells good," he said. Clara looked up, surprised. "The bread? It won't be ready for hours yet. I meant the stew." He gestured toward the pot simmering on the stove. "What did you put in it?" "Just what you had. Venison, potatoes, carrots, some dried herbs I found in the pantry." She hesitated. "Is that all right? I should have asked before using your supplies." "It's fine." He moved to the stove, lifted the lid, inhaled deeply. Ruth used to add herbs. I never could remember which ones. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife by name. Clara held her breath, afraid that if she moved or spoke, she would break whatever spell had loosened his tongue. "She was a good cook, Ruth," he continued, still staring into the pot. "Better than me. She always said I could burn water." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. There and gone so quickly, Clara almost missed it. She wasn't wrong. "How long were you married?" Clara asked softly. 3 years. He replaced the lid, turned to face her. "She died 5 years ago. Her and the baby." "I'm so sorry." He shrugged. But the movement was stiff, painful. "Like I said, long time ago. That doesn't make it hurt less." His eyes met hers. For a moment, Clara saw the depth of grief he carried, a vast, dark ocean of it, barely contained behind that stoic facade. Then he looked away. The moment passed. "Your husband," he said. "How did he die?" Clara's hands stilled on the dough. "A fever. 2 years ago." "Were you—" He paused, struggling with the words. "Did you love him?" It was an unexpectedly intimate question from a man who had barely spoken 10 words to her in 8 days. Clara considered lying. It would be easier, cleaner. But something in his eyes made her want to tell the truth. "No," she said. "I cared for him. I was grateful to him for marrying me when no one else would. But I didn't love him. Not the way I should have." "Why wouldn't anyone else marry you?" Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was considered inadequate, too plain, too outspoken. My family had no money, no connections. I was 24 when Thomas offered for me, already a spinster in most people's eyes." She resumed kneading the dough, focusing on the familiar motion. "He was a good man, Thomas. Older, quiet, not interested in passion or romance. But he was kind to me. He gave me a home, respect. I gave him companionship in his last years. It was enough." "And his brother." Clara's hands tightened on the dough. "Marcus is not like Thomas. He wanted me from the beginning. I could see it in the way he looked at me. Thomas saw it too. I think he made sure his will left everything to me, not Marcus, even though the estate was small. It was supposed to protect me, but it didn't. No. She forced herself to relax, to keep her voice steady. After Thomas died, Marcus made it clear that he intended to marry me. He said I had no right to Thomas' property, that it should have gone to him. He said that if I didn't agree willingly, he would find other ways to persuade me. Elijah's expression went dark. Did he hurt you? He tried. Once. Clara met his eyes, surprised by the steadiness she found in her own voice. I hit him with an oil lamp and ran. I've been running ever since. Something flickered across Elijah's face. Surprise, admiration, something else she could not name. An oil lamp. It was heavy. I hit him hard enough to set his sleeve on fire. A grim smile touched her lips. I hope I left a scar. The sound that escaped Elijah Stone was almost not quite, but almost a laugh. It was rusty and brief, like a door that had not been opened in years. But it was there. Mrs. Weston, he said, and there was warmth in his voice that had not been there before. I think you might be more dangerous than you look. Clara looked at this giant of a man, scarred and stern and alone, and felt something shift in her chest, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. I think the same might be said of you, Mr. Stone, she said softly. After that, things changed. 2 weeks of silence taught Clara more about Elijah Stone than 2 years of conversation could have. She learned that he ate his grief for breakfast, swallowed his loneliness with his evening whiskey, and starved himself of hope entirely. She learned that he talked to his horses more than he talked to her, and that the sound of children's laughter from the direction of town made him flinch like he had been shot. She learned that he was perhaps the loneliest man she had ever met, and that she was starting to care about that more than she should. The morning of her 15th day in the cabin, Clara went to the barn for firewood. The snow had stopped falling 2 days before. The world outside was white and crystalline and deceptively peaceful. She had just lifted a split log when she heard the growl. Clara froze. The wolf stood 20 feet away, gaunt with winter hunger. Its yellow eyes fixed on her with terrible focus, ribs showing beneath matted gray fur. Clara dropped the wood, backed toward the cabin slowly. Do not run. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Never run from a predator. It only makes you prey. The wolf advanced, muscles coiling. Clara turned and ran. She heard it behind her, paws crunching through snow, getting closer. She was not going to make it. The cabin was too far. The wolf was too fast. She tripped, went down hard, rolled onto her back, saw the wolf leaping through the air, jaws open, death coming. Crack! The gunshot split the morning silence. The wolf dropped, landed inches from her feet, dead before it hit the ground. Clara looked up. Elijah Stone stood on the porch, rifle still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. 50 yards away, one shot, through the skull. He lowered the weapon, walked toward her with that predatory grace that seemed so at odds with his size. You hurt. His voice was flat. Professional. No. I know. He nodded once, knelt beside the wolf, checked it was dead. They don't usually come this close to the cabin. Must be starving. He looked at her over his shoulder. You ever fire a gun? Clara hesitated. Lying seemed pointless now. My father taught me. But it's been years. Then we start tomorrow. A woman alone should know how to protect herself. A woman alone. Not a woman. Not my guest. Alone. Even standing 10 feet from her, Elijah Stone could not imagine a world where she was not eventually alone. Clara got to her feet, brushed snow from her skirt. That was an impressive shot. Lucky. It was not luck. She studied him. The casual way he held the rifle, the steadiness of his hands. You were a soldier. Something flickered in his eyes. Scout. Army scout? Long time ago. Where, here and there. He turned away. Enough questions, Mrs. Weston. We have chores to do. But Clara had seen something. Behind the gruff dismissal. Behind the walls he had built. Elijah Stone was not just a farmer who happened to be good with a rifle. He was something else entirely. Something dangerous. And somehow that made her feel safer than she had in years. 3 days later, Elijah announced they were going to town. I need supplies, he said over breakfast. You can come if you want. Might do you good to see something besides this cabin. Clara agreed immediately. The isolation had been necessary at first, but now it felt more like imprisonment. She needed to see other people, to remember that the world existed beyond these 4 walls. They rode in silence through snow-heavy pines, Elijah on his black gelding Thunder, Clara on a gentler mare named Bessie. The morning was cold but clear, the sky impossibly blue. Clara watched the landscape unfold around her. Elk watching from a frozen meadow, the distant peak of Emigrant Mountain catching the morning light, the Yellowstone River Valley spread below them, ice-choked and beautiful. This is magnificent, she breathed. Elijah glanced at her. Most people find it lonely. Most people are fools. Something shifted in his expression, almost a smile, but it vanished before it could fully form. Copper Creek appeared after another hour of riding, a small town tucked into a valley. Maybe 200 people if you counted the surrounding ranches. Main Street was rutted with frozen mud. Buildings lined both sides. Brennan's boarding house with its 2-story facade and painted sign. White Horse Smithy with forge smoke rising. The Rusty Spur Saloon. Piano audible even from outside. A small bank. A general store, a church with a crooked steeple, and the sheriff's office, with a young deputy outside cleaning his rifle. The townsfolk reaction to Elijah was immediate and unsettling. People literally crossed the street to avoid him. Women pulled children inside. Men did not meet his eyes. Conversations stopped as they passed. Clara watched, horrified and fascinated. They fear you, she said quietly. They should. Why? Elijah did not answer. Just dismounted in front of the general store and tied his horse to the rail. Stay close, he said, and don't talk to anyone about where you're staying. Clara wanted to argue, but something in his tone stopped her. She followed him into the store, watched him conduct business with a shopkeeper who could barely look at him, noted how the man took Elijah's money with trembling hands. When they emerged, a woman was waiting outside, silver hair pinned severely back, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, hands roughened by decades of work. Small, but formidable. The woman studied Clara with those knowing eyes. You're staying with Stone, Clara startled. He gave me shelter from the storm. I'm passing through. The woman's expression softened slightly. I know that look, child. The one that says you're running from something with teeth. I wore it myself once. 40 years ago. I don't know what you mean. Course you don't. The woman pressed a wrapped bundle into Clara's hands. Bread, still warm. Whatever you're running from, you could do worse than Elijah Stone. The town fears him, but they're fools. That man's got more goodness in his little finger than most folks have in their whole body. He's just buried it so deep he's forgotten it's there. Who are you? Martha Brennan. I run the boarding house. She smiled. And I make it my business to know everyone else's business. You need anything, you come find me. Understand? Clara nodded. Thank you. Martha disappeared into the crowd. Clara watched her go, wondering what the woman had seen that made her so certain about Elijah Stone. A voice called out behind her. So you're the woman who fell through Ellis' door. Clara turned. A man stood at the entrance to the smithy. Half Cherokee, half Irish by the look of him. Long, gray, streaked black hair, weathered face, missing his left ear. but his smile was genuine and warm. "First visitor he's had in 5 years." The man continued. "I was starting to think he'd turned into an actual hermit. People seem afraid of him. People are idiots." The man set down his hammer, wiped his hands on his leather apron. "You want to know what kind of man Elijah Stone is? He once rode 40 miles through Apache territory to bring medicine to a dying Crow child. He saved my life twice. Once from Confederates at Chickamauga, once from my own stupidity at Adobe Walls, and that business in Missouri." The man's expression darkened. "He killed a man, yes, but that man was a monster. Eli saved 12 women from a fate worse than death, but the monster's father was a judge. So," he shrugged, "justice ain't always just. I'm Samuel Whitehorse. Most folks call me Sam. You need anything while Ellis being his usual charming self, you come find me." Clara thanked him, her mind racing. 12 women, a judge, a killing that might not have been murder at all. Who was Elijah Stone really? She found him loading supplies onto the horses, his expression unreadable as always. "Your friends are very protective of you," she said. "I don't have friends." Sam Whitehorse seems to think otherwise. Elijah grunted. "Sam talks too much. He told me about Missouri." Elijah's hands stilled on the saddlebag. "Did he now? Some of it." Clara stepped closer. "He said you saved 12 women. He said the man you killed was a monster." Silence stretched between them. When Elijah finally spoke, his voice was rough. "It was a long time ago. That seems to be your answer for everything. Because it's the truth." He finished securing the supplies, turned to face her. "The man I killed deserved to die. His father disagreed. Made sure I'd hang if I ever stood trial. So I came here. Started over. Tried to be someone else." He paused. Didn't work out so well. Clara wanted to ask more. About Missouri. About the women he had saved. About the judge who had wanted him dead. But then she noticed something that drove every other thought from her mind. A man standing outside the sheriff's office. Lean. Weathered. Eyes like a rattlesnake. 2 fingers missing from his left hand. He stood perfectly still, watching them. No, not them. Watching her. As if sensing her attention, the man turned. His gaze found hers across the muddy street. Something flickered there. Recognition. Interest. Then he smiled. Clara's blood turned to ice. "Elijah." Her voice came out strangled. "Who is that man?" Elijah followed her gaze. His entire body went rigid. "Virgil Harding." The name dropped like a stone into still water. "He was Army Scout. Same unit as me." A pause. "He's a hired killer now, has been for years." "What is he doing in Copper Creek?" Elijah did not answer, but his hand moved to his rifle, and he did not take his eyes off Virgil Harding until they were out of town. The man's smile followed Clara all the way home. That night Clara could not sleep. She lay in the bed that smelled of cedar and grief, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Virgil Harding, about his cold eyes, about his smile. Marcus had found her. It was the only explanation. He had sent someone ahead. To track her, to watch her, to wait. She should run, take one of Elijah's horses and disappear into the mountains. Lead the danger away from the man who had saved her life. But where would she go? The snow was still too deep, the cold too brutal. She would die out there, alone and frozen and forgotten. And maybe that would be better than what Marcus had planned for her. A sound from the main room. Clara rose, crept to the door, cracked it open. Elijah sat before the fire, the child's bonnet in his hands again, but this time he was not weeping. He was talking. "I know you're watching me, Ruth," he said softly. "I know you can see what a mess I've made of things." His voice cracked. "There's a woman here now. She's running from something bad, someone who wants to hurt her, and I want to help. But I'm scared, Ruth. I'm scared that if I let her in, I'll lose her too. Like I lost you. Like I lost Lily. He pressed the bonnet to his face, inhaled. I don't know what to do, he whispered. I don't know how to be anything but alone anymore. Clara eased the door shut, her heart breaking for this man who carried so much pain. She thought about the journal she had found, the frantic handwriting. They found us. She thought about Ruth, about the baby named Lily, about what had really happened in this cabin 5 years ago. And she made a decision. Tomorrow she would tell Elijah the truth, all of it, about Marcus, about the danger she had brought to his door. He deserved to know. He deserved to choose whether to help her or not. And maybe, just maybe, they could face whatever was coming together. Clara climbed back into bed, pulled the quilts around her. And for the first time since she had fled Kansas, she allowed herself to hope. The rifle felt foreign in Clara's hands. Or that was what she let Elijah believe. Hold it steady, he instructed, adjusting her grip. Squeeze, don't pull. Clara took aim at the bottle set up on a fence post 30 yards away. Drew a breath. Squeezed the trigger. The bullet went wide, deliberately. Again, Elijah said. She fired, missed, fired again, missed again. Your stance is perfect. Elijah stepped closer. Your breathing is controlled. You know exactly what you're doing. Those gray eyes pinned her in place. So why are you pretending you don't? The words came out before she could stop them. Because the last man who saw me handle a gun didn't appreciate it. Silence. Marcus, Elijah said. Not a question. Clara's throat tightened. How did you know his name? You talk in your sleep. He stepped back, giving her space. Show me what you can actually do. Clara looked at him, at this man who had taken her in, fed her, protected her, who deserved better than her lies. She turned, raised the rifle, fired 3 times in rapid succession. 3 bottles exploded, dead center. Elijah watched without expression. When she finished, he nodded once. Your father taught you. He said a woman should never depend on a man to save her. Smart man. Clara ejected the spent cartridges, her hands steady. He died when I was 19. Sometimes I think that's when I stopped being myself. Started being what everyone else needed me to be. Elijah was quiet for a long moment. That's a hard way to live. It's the only way I knew. Until now. They stood in silence, the morning air cold and crisp around them. There's something I need to tell you, Clara said finally. About why I'm running. About who sent Virgil Harding. Elijah met her eyes. I figured it wasn't just a lovesick brother-in-law. It's worse than that. Much worse. She told him everything. About Thomas. About the inheritance. About the land in Montana Territory that Clara had never even seen. About Marcus and his obsession. About the night she had fled. When she finished, Elijah was silent for a long moment. This land Thomas left you, he said slowly. You know where it is. Eagle Ridge, 20 miles northeast. I have the deed in my saddlebag. Thomas bought it years ago as an investment. Eagle Ridge. Something shifted in Elijah's expression. There's been talk about that area. Rumors. What kind of rumors? Silver. A prospector found traces last summer. If your land sits on that vein, it's worth a fortune. Potentially millions. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Marcus knew. He must have. She stopped, struggled to process what this meant. He doesn't just want you, Elijah said quietly. He wants what you own. And the only way to get it legally is to marry you, or have you declared incompetent so he can become your guardian. Either way, he controls the land. And me. Either way. Clara sank onto a nearby log, her legs suddenly weak. Thomas suspected, she whispered. He must have. That's why he left everything to me. He was trying to protect me. Looks like your husband was a better man than you gave him credit for. Clara nodded. grief for Thomas welling up fresh. Not romantic love, but genuine sorrow for a man who had tried so hard to keep her safe. "There's something else," she said. "Something I haven't told anyone." Elijah's eyes narrowed. Thomas didn't die of illness. Not naturally. He was healthy for years. Then suddenly, over 6 months, he wasted away. The doctor said consumption, but he never coughed, never had the symptoms. Just grew weaker and weaker until he couldn't lift his head. "You think Marcus poisoned him?" "I think Marcus poisoned him. I've thought it for 2 years, but I had no proof. No power. Nothing." She looked up at Elijah, her eyes burning. "If Marcus wants a war, I'll give him one." Something flickered in Elijah's expression. "Respect, maybe. Or something more complicated. You know that Virgil Harding being here means Marcus won't be far behind." "I know. And you know that when he comes, it won't be pretty." "I know that too." Elijah was quiet for a moment, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. Then he nodded. "All right, Mrs. Weston," he said. "If we're going to do this, we do it together. No more secrets, no more holding back." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been tight for 2 years. No more secrets, she agreed. That night, she finally read Ruth's journal. She had meant to tell Elijah about it, but the conversation had taken a different turn. And now, sitting alone by the fire while Elijah checked the animals, she found herself opening the leather-bound book. The early entries were love letters to a life that no longer existed. March 3rd, 1878. "Eli finished the rocking chair today. Said he made it for the baby, but I caught him sitting in it himself, grinning like a fool. I love him more than I have words for. I thought I knew what love was before I came west. I was wrong." May 15th, 1878. Baby Lily has her father's eyes, gray as storm clouds. She has his stubbornness, too. Lord help us all when she's old enough to argue. Clara smiled despite herself. The Ruth in these pages was warm, funny, deeply in love with her husband and daughter. But as the entries continued, the tone changed. August 20th, 1878. Saw men watching the cabin today. 3 of them. Eli says I'm imagining things, but I know what I saw. They're looking for us, for him. I can feel it. September 5th, 1878. Eli rode to town for supplies. The men were back. I kept Lily inside. Didn't let them see her. Please God, let Eli come home soon. The final entry was dated October 18th, 1878. The handwriting frantic, uneven. They came today. 3 men, looking for Eli. He's in town. He doesn't know. I hid Lily in the root cellar. Please God, let her stay quiet. They're at the door. I can hear them. If anyone finds this, tell Eli I love him. Tell him it wasn't his fault. Tell him. The entry ended there. The next page had been torn out. Clara closed the journal, her hands trembling. Ruth Stone had not died in childbirth. She'd been murdered. And the baby. Lily. Where was she now? The door opened. Elijah stepped inside, stopped when he saw her face. What's wrong? Clara held up the journal. I found this. In the dresser. She swallowed. I read it. I'm sorry. I should have told you, but... Elijah's face went white. Where did you? He stopped, took a breath. You read it, all of it. Yes. Silence. Heavy. Terrible. Elijah crossed to the chair by the fire, sank into it like a man who had lost the strength to stand. Now you know, he said quietly. Ruth didn't die in childbirth. No. His voice cracked. She didn't. What happened? Clara moved to kneel beside him. What really happened? For a long moment she thought he would not answer. His jaw worked, his hands clenched and unclenched. Then the words came, rough, broken. The man I killed in Missouri, Silas Morrison. His father was a judge, corrupt, powerful. He wanted revenge. He spent 2 years looking for me. When he finally found us, Elijah stopped. Started again. I was in town, buying supplies, flour, salt, a ribbon for Lily's hair. When I got back, the cabin was burning. Oh, Elijah. Ruth was in the yard. He could not say it. Lily was in the root cellar. Ruth had hidden her there. But when I opened the hatch, a breath that was almost a sob. Empty. Just the blanket Ruth had wrapped her in. They took her. I don't know. I searched for 3 months. Every trail, every rumor, every lead. Nothing. Elijah looked at Clara, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had died years ago and had not stopped breathing yet. She'd be 5 years old now. If she's alive. If someone took her and kept her. But I don't know. He'll never know. And that's the worst part. Not knowing. Clara took his hand, held it tight. I'm so sorry. It's my fault. If I had been here, if I hadn't gone to town that day. You couldn't have known. I should have known. His voice was savage. I should have protected them. That's what a husband does. That's what a father does. And I failed. I failed them both. Clara squeezed his hand harder. You didn't fail them. The men who killed Ruth failed them. The judge who sent them failed them. You are not to blame for their evil. Elijah looked at her, something breaking behind his eyes. Why are you telling me this? Because someone should have told you 5 years ago. Because you've been carrying this guilt alone for too long. Because... She paused, took a breath. Because you deserve to know that you're not the monster this town thinks you are. You're a man who loved his family, who lost them to cruelty and violence, and who has been punishing himself ever since for something that was never his fault. Tears slid down Elijah's face. The giant wept, and Clara held his hand, and the fire crackled between them. I don't know how to stop, he whispered. I don't know how to be anything but guilty. Then let me help you, Clara said softly. Let me stay. Not as a guest, not as someone passing through. Let me stay and maybe we can figure it out together. Elijah looked at her for a long moment. Those gray eyes wet with tears but clearer somehow, like some of the burden had been lifted. Why would you do that? Because you saved my life. Because you took me in when you had every reason to turn me away. Because... She hesitated, then said the truth. Because when I'm with you, I feel like myself for the first time in years. The silence stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Elijah lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. All right, Mrs. Weston, he said quietly. All right. The days that followed were a revelation. Without the weight of secrets between them, Clara and Elijah began to build something new. Not quite friendship, not quite romance. Something in between that had no name and needed none. They worked side by side, feeding the animals, mending fences, preparing for whatever Marcus would bring. They talked in the evenings about their pasts, their fears, their impossible hopes. Clara learned that Elijah had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who drank too much and a mother who died too young. He had joined the army at 17, found he had a talent for tracking, for violence, for surviving when others did not. She learned that he had met Ruth at a church social in Kansas, that she had looked at him and seen something worth loving when everyone else saw only danger, that they had come west together to build a life free from the shadow of his past. She learned that when Ruth died, something inside Elijah had died with her, and that he had spent 5 years trying to bury it. Elijah learned about Clara in return, about her childhood on a Kansas ranch, about her parents who had loved her fiercely and died too soon, about the sisters who had scattered across the country seeking their own chances at better lives. He learned about Thomas, The older man who had married Clara out of kindness and loneliness, who had given her everything he could without ever asking for what she could not give, who had perhaps known he was dying, had perhaps guessed his brother was killing him, and had still found a way to protect her. He learned about the fear that had defined her life since Thomas died, and the courage it had taken to run. He learned that Clara Weston was far stronger than she looked. 3 weeks after she arrived, the snow began to melt, just at the edges, just enough to suggest that spring might eventually come. Clara stood on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of gold and rose and purple. The mountains stood eternal against the fading light. Footsteps behind her, then Elijah's presence, warm and solid at her back. "Beautiful," she said. "It is." But he was not looking at the sunset. Clara turned, found him watching her with an expression she had never seen before. Something soft, something vulnerable. "Clara." His voice was rough. "There's something I need to tell you." Her heart beat faster. "What is it?" "I've been alone for 5 years. Since Ruth. I told myself it was to protect others, that anyone who got close to me would be in danger." He paused. "But that was a lie. I was just scared. Scared to feel anything again. Scared to lose someone else." "Elijah, let me finish." He stepped closer. "You came through my door half dead and stubborn as hell, and you made me feel things I thought I was done feeling. I don't know what this is between us. I don't know where it's going. But I know I don't want you to leave. Not when the snow melts. Not ever." Clara reached up, touched his face, the rough stubble, the scar. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying." He caught her hand, pressed his lips to her palm. "I'm saying, I think I might be falling in love with you, Clara Weston, and that terrifies me more than anything Marcus can throw at us." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Good tears. The kind that came from too much feeling. "I'm terrified too," she whispered, "but I'm more terrified of leaving, of never knowing what this could have been." Elijah pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, his chin resting on her head. "Then stay," he said. "Whatever comes. We face it together." Together. She agreed, and when he kissed her, it felt like coming home. They did not speak of what happened next. Some things were private, sacred, meant only for the two people involved. But Clara woke the next morning in Elijah's arms, in Ruth's bed, in a cabin that no longer felt haunted. She knew this was fast, knew that under normal circumstances she would have taken more time, been more careful. But these were not normal circumstances, and she was done being careful, done making the safe choice, done living her life according to what other people expected. She loved Elijah Stone, scars and shadows and all. And if she only had weeks or months before Marcus came to destroy everything, she would make every moment count. "When this is over," Elijah said, voice still rough with sleep, "marry me." Clara smiled against his chest. "You're proposing to me while lying in bed. I'm proposing to you because I want something to fight for, something more than survival." He tilted her chin up, met her eyes. "I want a life, with you, whatever that looks like. Yes, just like that, just like that." He kissed her, slow and sweet, and full of promise. "Then we better make sure we're alive to actually get married," Clara said when they finally broke apart. "Marcus won't wait forever." "No," Elijah agreed. "He won't." That afternoon, Deputy Jake rode out to the cabin. Clara saw him coming from the window, recognized the young face, the eager expression. But there was worry there, too, and that worried her. "Elijah," she called, "we have a visitor." Elijah joined her at the window, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. "That's Jake Reed, the deputy." He relaxed slightly. "He's a good kid, good enough to trust." As much as I trust anyone. Jake dismounted at the porch, removed his hat when Clara answered the door. Ma'am, Mr. Stone. He nodded to each of them. I came to warn you. There's been trouble in town. What kind of trouble? Elijah asked. Man named Marcus Weston arrived yesterday. Says he's looking for his sister-in-law. Says she's mentally unwell. That she ran away from Kansas and needs to be brought home for treatment. Clara's blood went cold. His lying, I figured as much. Jake's expression was grim. The man is too smooth, too prepared. And the sheriff took money from him. I saw it. Dalton is corrupt. Dalton is weak. Jake corrected. His wife's been sick. Needs medicine they can't afford. Marcus offered to help. Dalton didn't ask too many questions about why. Elijah swore under his breath. What's Marcus claiming exactly? That Mrs. Weston is mentally unfit. That she needs to be returned to Kansas for evaluation. Jake's jaw tightened. He's got papers. Official looking. But I've seen real court documents, and these feel wrong. Because they're forged, Clara said. Marcus doesn't want to help me. He wants to control me. He wants the land Thomas left me. Land! Jake's eyes widened. What land? Clara told him. About Eagle Ridge, about the silver rumors, about Thomas and the poisoning she suspected but could not prove. When she finished, Jake was pale. That changes things, he said quietly. That's not just a family dispute. That's murder, Clara said flatly, and theft, and kidnapping if he gets his way. Jake nodded slowly. Mr. Stone, I know what people say about you, but Sam's told me stories, real stories, and I'd rather trust you than a snake in a fancy coat. What are you saying? I'm saying if you need help, you can count on me, whatever happens. Elijah studied the young deputy for a long moment, then extended his hand. Thank you, Jake shook it. He'll keep my eyes open in town. Let you know if anything changes. One more thing, Clara said. The man with Marcus. Virgil Harding. Do you know where he's staying? Brennan's boarding house, but he's been spending a lot of time with Marcus. Thick as thieves, those two. Elijah and Clara exchanged a look. Watch your back, Jake, Elijah said. Men like Virgil don't leave witnesses. Jake nodded. Put his hat back on. Mounted his horse. Be careful, he said. Both of you. Then he rode away, and Clara felt the noose tightening around them. That night she could not sleep. She lay in Elijah's arms, listening to his heartbeat, thinking about Marcus, about Virgil, about what was coming, what's wrong. Elijah's voice rumbled in the darkness. Just thinking. About how this ends, whether we can actually win, or if Marcus is going to take everything from me like he took Thomas. Elijah's arms tightened around her. He won't, how can you be sure? Because I've lost everything before, and I survived. This time I have something to fight for. He pressed a kiss to her hair. I have you. Clara turned in his arms, found his face in the darkness. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that whatever happens, you won't blame yourself. If things go wrong. If Marcus wins. If... She swallowed. If I don't make it. Don't spend another 5 years punishing yourself. Silence. Long. Heavy. I can't promise that, he said finally. Try. For me. He kissed her. Soft. Tender. I'll try. He whispered. But the best way to keep that promise is to make sure you make it through this. Agreed. They held each other in the darkness. Two broken people who had found something worth fighting for. And outside the window, the mountains stood watch over them. Marcus Weston arrived in Copper Creek on a Thursday morning riding a horse that cost more than most men earned in a year. He wore a tailored coat and a silk cravat and a smile that could charm the skin off a snake. Within an hour, he had introduced himself to the sheriff, made a generous donation to the church rebuilding fund, and expressed deep concern for his poor, disturbed sister-in-law who had fled Kansas in a state of mental distress. By noon, half the town believed Clara Weston was a madwoman. By sunset, the other half was not sure. Martha Brennan watched from her boarding house window and did not believe a single word. Sam Whitehorse watched from his forge and wondered how long before the violence started. And Deputy Jake Reed watched from the sheriff's office and knew he had to make a choice. Elijah learned of Marcus's activities from Jake the next morning. The young deputy rode out before dawn with news and warnings. "He's smart," Jake said. "He'll give him that. He's playing the concerned family member perfectly. Half the town thinks you've kidnapped a crazy woman. And the other half is waiting to see what happens." Jake shifted uncomfortably. Sheriff Dalton signed papers this morning. Official documents authorizing Marcus to take custody of Clara as her closest living relative. Those documents are forged. Doesn't matter. The sheriff says they're valid. That makes them valid until a judge says otherwise. And the nearest judge is in Helena. 3 weeks' ride at best. Clara felt her stomach drop. "So, legally, Marcus can just take me." "Legally, yes." Jake met her eyes. "But legality and morality ain't always the same thing. And I know which side I want to be on. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that when Marcus comes for you, he might find more resistance than he expected. I'm suggesting that some folks in this town owe Elijah Stone their lives or their livelihoods, and might be willing to repay that debt. I'm suggesting," he paused, "I'm suggesting that sometimes justice comes from the people, not the law." "That's dangerous talk for a deputy." "Yes, ma'am, it is." Elijah had been silent throughout. Now he spoke. "How many men does Marcus have?" "4, including Virgil. All of them look like they've killed before, plus whatever local help Dalton provides." "And how many people might stand with us?" Jake considered. "Sam, for certain. Martha Brennan has a shotgun and knows how to use it. A few ranchers who owe you favors." He counted on his fingers. "Maybe 15. 20 if word spreads. Against trained killers." "Against trained killers." Jake agreed. "Not great odds." Number Elijah looked at Clara, but not impossible either. After Jake left, they began preparing in earnest. Elijah fortified the cabin, boarding up windows, creating firing positions, stockpiling ammunition. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had done this before, who knew exactly how to turn a home into a fortress. Clara helped where she could, loading rifles, preparing bandages, making sure they had food and water to last a siege. "You learned this in the army," she said as they worked. "I learned this surviving," Elijah replied. "The army just gave it a name." That night, Sam Whitehorse arrived with news. "Marcus been asking about you, Eli, about your past, about Missouri. Let him ask. He found something." Sam hesitated. "He's telling people you're wanted for murder, that you killed a man in cold blood and fled before trial." Elijah's jaw tightened. "That man was trafficking women. I freed 12 of them, including Thomas Weston's sister." "I know. But Marcus is spinning it differently. He's saying you killed an innocent man and that anyone who helps you is harboring a fugitive." Clara felt cold fear settle in her stomach. "Will people believe him?" "Some will," Sam admitted. "Fear is a powerful thing, and Marcus knows how to use it." Elijah slammed his fist against the wall. "Damn it. Eli." Sam stepped closer. "You know what has to happen. You have to tell your story, not to the town, but to the people who matter. Let them know the truth about Missouri, about Ruth, about all of it. I can't. You have to. If people are going to risk their lives for you, they deserve to know what they're risking them for." Silence. Long and heavy. Clara took Elijah's hand. "He is right," she said softly. "The truth is your best weapon." Elijah looked at her, at Sam, at the cabin he had built with Ruth, at the life he had tried so hard to protect. "All right," he said finally. "He'll tell them. All of it." The next evening, a small group gathered at the cabin. Sam, Martha, Jake, a rancher named Tom, whose son Elijah had saved from drowning, a widow named Sarah, whose husband Elijah had buried when no one else would, others who had experienced his quiet kindness over the years. Elijah stood before them, Clara at his side. He told them everything. About Missouri, about the trafficker he had killed, about the judge's revenge, about Ruth and Lily, about the 5 years of isolation and guilt. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Martha Brennan spoke. "I've known there was something in your past, Elijah Stone. Something that drove you to hide up here alone." She moved forward, looked him in the eye. "But I also know what kind of man you are. I see it every time you help someone without asking for anything in return. I see it in the way you treat your animals, in the way you look at this woman who's come into your life." She turned to face the group. "This man is not a murderer. He's a protector. And right now, someone he loves needs protecting. Are we going to help him or not?" One by one they nodded. "Tom, Sarah, the others, we're with you," Tom said. "Whatever comes." Elijah swallowed hard. Clara saw the emotion he was struggling to contain. "Thank you," he said roughly. "All of you. Don't thank us yet," Sam said. "Marcus isn't going to give up easily, and Virgil Harding is the most dangerous man I've ever known besides you, Eli." "I know." Elijah looked at Clara, his eyes soft despite the hard situation. "But this time, I am not fighting alone." The next morning, Sheriff Dalton arrived with 4 deputies and a piece of paper. "Elijah Stone," Dalton called from outside the cabin. "I have a warrant for your arrest. Murder in Missouri, 1871. You're to come with me peacefully." Clara felt her heart stop. Elijah stepped onto the porch, his rifle in his hands but not raised. "That warrant is based on lies. That's for a court to decide." Dalton held up the paper. "This came by telegraph from Kansas. Marcus Weston provided the evidence. It's legally binding. Evidence he fabricated. Maybe." Dalton looked uncomfortable. "But until a judge says otherwise, my hands are tied." Clara stepped out beside Elijah. "And what about me, Sheriff? Am I to be arrested too?" Dalton could not meet her eyes. "You're to be taken into protective custody. Mr. Weston has expressed concern about your mental state. You'll need to be evaluated by doctors Marcus pays for." Clara felt fury rising in her chest. "In Kansas, where he controls everything. That's the law, ma'am. The law." Clara laughed bitterly. "The law is whatever Marcus Weston wants it to be. He murdered my husband, Sheriff, poisoned him slowly over 6 months, and now he's using the law to steal everything Thomas left me. Those are serious accusations. They're the truth. And if you take us back to Kansas, you'll be helping a murderer get away with his crimes." Dalton hesitated. For a moment, Clara thought she saw doubt in his eyes. Then Marcus Weston stepped out from behind the deputies. "Really, Clara," he said, his smile poisonous. "Such dramatic accusations. And from a woman who clearly needs professional help." He shook his head sadly. "Take them both, Sheriff. The sooner we get Clara the treatment she needs, the better." Elijah moved. One moment he was standing still. The next his rifle was aimed at Marcus's chest. "One more step." His voice was deadly. "And I put a bullet through your heart." Everyone froze. "Elijah," Clara whispered. "Don't. He killed Thomas." Elijah's eyes never left Marcus. "He sent men to kill Ruth, to kill my daughter, and now he wants to take you." "Do you really expect me to just let that happen?" "No, but this isn't the way." Clara stepped closer, touched his arm. "If you kill him now, you're everything they say you are. And they win." Silence. Terrible. Endless. Then slowly Elijah lowered the rifle. Marcus let out a breath he had been holding. "Smart choice, Stone." He gestured to the deputies. "Arrest him." They moved forward, put Elijah in irons, loaded him on a horse. Clara watched helplessly, every instinct screaming at her to fight, but she was surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. Elijah looked at her as they led him away. "Sam will come," he said quietly. "Jake will help. Trust me." She nodded, not trusting her voice. Then they were gone, and Clara was alone, with Marcus. He stepped toward her, that predatory smile back in place. "Finally," he said. Just you and me, the way it was always meant to be. Clara raised her chin. You're a monster, Marcus. I'm a businessman. There's a difference. He circled her slowly. Thomas was weak. Thomas was, sentimental. He actually loved you. His little charity case bride. He laughed. I tried to tell him you weren't worth it, but he never listened to me. He knew what you were. He suspected. That is different. He protected me from you, even in death. Marcus's jaw tightened. That land should have been mine. The estate, the bank shares, all of it, but no. He left everything to you. Because he knew, Clara said. He knew you poisoned him. He knew you would come for me. And he found a way to protect me anyway. Protection. Marcus sneered. From a dead man. That's no protection at all, Clara. You're alone now. Your giant is in jail. Your friends are scattered. And I have all the power, not all of it. Clara thought of the people who had gathered at the cabin, of Sam and Martha and Jake, of the truth that was spreading through Copper Creek even now. You haven't won yet, Marcus. Haven't I? No. She met his eyes. You haven't. Something flickered in his face. Uncertainty, maybe. Or anger. You'll learn, Clara, he said quietly. You always were stubborn. But you'll learn. He turned and walked away, left her standing alone in front of the cabin that had become her home. Clara watched him go, her hands shaking with rage. Then she went inside, found the rifle Elijah had left hidden behind the door. I will not be a victim, she whispered to the empty room. Not anymore. And she began to plan. Clara did not sleep that night. She sat by the window with the rifle across her lap, watching the darkness, waiting for Marcus to make his move. He would come, she knew that. Now that Elijah was gone, Marcus would feel safe, confident, ready to claim what he believed was his. But Clara was not the helpless woman Marcus thought she was. She had skills, she had allies, and she had something to fight for. As dawn broke, footsteps sounded on the porch. Clara raised the rifle, aimed at the door. It swung open. Sam Whitehorse stood in the doorway, his hands raised. Easy, it's me. Clara lowered the weapon, her heart pounding. What happened? Elijah escaped. Jake helped him. He's on his way to Martha's place now. He sent me to get you. Relief flooded through her. Then we need to go. Not so fast. Sam stepped inside, closed the door. There's been movement in town. Marcus men are watching the roads. We try to leave now they'll see us. So we wait. Sam moved to the window, peered out. Jake says Marcus is planning something. Doesn't know what exactly, but Virgil was asking about the back trails, the ones that lead up into the mountains. They're trying to cut off our escape routes. Looks like. Sam turned to face her. Elijah has a plan, but it's risky. What kind of plan? The kind where people might get hurt. Clara thought of Marcus, of Thomas dying slowly over 6 months, of Ruth strangled in her own yard, of a baby named Lily who had never been found. People have already been hurt, she said quietly. It's time to end this. Sam studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You're tougher than you look, Mrs. Weston. I keep hearing that. They waited until dark. Moving through the shadows, Clara and Sam made their way toward town. The night was cold, clear. Stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Halfway there, they met Jake. Elijah's at Martha's, he said. She's been gathering people all day. We have 18 ready to fight. Against how many? Marcus has 5 men, plus Dalton and his deputies. Though I don't think the deputies will fight if it comes to that. They're not being paid enough to die. What about Dalton himself? Jake shook his head. He's been drinking since the arrest. Guilt, I think. He knows what he's doing is wrong. He just doesn't know how to stop. They reached Martha's boarding house through the back door. Clara found herself in a crowded kitchen filled with people she barely knew. But they all looked at her with something like respect. And then Elijah was there. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulled her into his arms. "You're all right," he said against her hair. "I'm fine. You?" "Better now." He pulled back, looked at her face. "I was worried Marcus would." "He didn't." Clara met his eyes. "He tried to intimidate me. It didn't work." Something fierce flashed in Elijah's expression. "That's my girl." Martha stepped forward, her silver hair gleaming in the lamplight. "As touching as this reunion is, we have work to do," she said. "Marcus isn't going to wait forever." "What do we know?" Elijah asked. Sam took over. Marcus' men are spread around town, 2 at the jail, 2 watching the roads. Virgil is with Marcus at the hotel. And Dalton, passed out in his office. Jake put him there. With any luck, hell sleep through everything. Elijah nodded slowly. "Here's what we're going to do." He outlined the plan. Simple but effective. Create a distraction at one end of town. Draw Marcus and his men into the open. Then confront them with overwhelming numbers. "We don't want bloodshed if we can avoid it," Elijah said. "But if they start shooting, we finish it." Clara listened, her heart hammering. This could work. It could actually work. Or they could all die trying. "What about me?" she asked when Elijah finished. "What do you need me to do? Stay here, where it's safe?" "No." The word was flat, firm, final. Elijah frowned. "Clara, you promised." She stepped closer. "You promised to let me stand beside you, not behind you. This is different. Marcus people have guns. They're trained killers. And I'm a pretty good shot myself. Remember, Clara, this is exactly what I signed up for." She held his gaze. "I spent 2 years being protected by a man who died anyway. I spent 11 days running from a monster who caught me anyway. If I'm going to face Marcus, I want to do it on my feet, not hiding in a kitchen." Silence. The whole room watching. Then Elijah sighed. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met." "I know." He almost smiled. "All right, you can cover the back, but you stay in position. You don't go charging into anything." "Agreed. Agreed." They moved at midnight. Clara took her position behind a water trough at the far end of Main Street. She could see the hotel where Marcus was staying, could see the dim light in his window. Her hands were steady on the rifle, her breathing controlled. This was it. One way or another, it ended tonight. A whistle sounded from the other end of town. The signal. Then everything happened at once. Fire erupted from the stables. Not a real fire, just smoke and noise designed to draw attention. Marcus' men came running, shouting, confused. And in the chaos, Sam and his people moved into position. Clara watched as the trap closed. As Marcus' hired guns found themselves surrounded by farmers and ranchers with hunting rifles. Most of them threw down their weapons without a fight. The odds were too bad. The money Marcus paid not worth dying for. But 2 men refused to surrender, and one of them was Virgil Harding. Clara saw him emerge from the hotel, calm, controlled, a pistol in each hand. He looked around at the chaos, assessed the situation. Then his eyes found Clara. He smiled. Clara raised her rifle, but before she could fire, Virgil ducked behind a wagon, disappeared into the shadows. He was coming for her. She moved, found new cover, kept the rifle ready. Footsteps behind her. She spun. Nothing. "Hello, Clara." The voice came from her left. She turned again. Virgil Harding stood 10 feet away. His gun pointed at her chest. "Drop the rifle." She did not move. Virgil sighed. "I don't actually want to kill you. You are worth too much alive. But if you make this difficult..." He shrugged. "Accidents happen. You killed them." Clara said. "Ruth and Lily, you were there." Something flickered in Virgil's eyes. Morrison paid well, and Stone had crossed some powerful people. She was a mother. Lily was 8 months old. Virgil smiled. That cold, dead smile. The child was a liability. I did what needed to be done. Rage flooded through Clara, red and hot and blinding. She raised the rifle. Virgil was faster. The bullet hit her shoulder, spun her around. She fell, the rifle skittering away. Pain, white-hot and searing, foolish. Virgil walked toward her. Should have dropped the weapon when I told you. He stood over her, gun aimed at her head. Marcus wants you alive, he said. But I'm starting to think that's not worth the trouble. Clara closed her eyes. Then a shot rang out. Virgil's gun flew from his hand. He screamed, clutched his bleeding wrist. Clara opened her eyes. Elijah Stone stood at the end of the alley, rifle raised, face like thunder. Get away from her! Virgil laughed, even through the pain. Stone. I was wondering when you'd show up. He pulled a knife from his belt, moved toward Clara. Elijah fired again. Hit Virgil in the leg. The killer went down. Clara scrambled back, found her rifle, ignored the fire in her shoulder and raised it. Virgil looked up at them both, blood pooling beneath him. Going to kill me, Stone. I should. Elijah's voice was ice. After what you did. After Ruth. After Lily. Clara saw his finger tighten on the trigger. Elijah, she said softly. He looked at her. Don't. She held his gaze. Don't become what he wants you to be. The longest moment. Elijah standing over the man who had destroyed his family, the man who had haunted his nightmares for 5 years. Then slowly he lowered the rifle. Tie him up, he said to someone behind him. He's going to stand trial for everything. Virgil laughed, a wet, bitter sound. You think justice exists? You think a judge will care about a baby I dropped in a river 5 years ago? Clara felt her blood freeze. What? The Yellowstone runs fast that time of year. Virgil was still smiling. No body to find, no evidence, no loose ends. Elijah went very still. You killed Lily. I ended a problem. Different thing. Elijah moved. Clara had never seen anything so fast. One moment he was standing still, the next his hands were around Virgil's throat. I will end you. Elijah, Clara grabbed his arm. Elijah, stop. He hesitated, looking at her with eyes full of rage and grief. Has not worth it, she said. Has not worth your soul. A heartbeat. 2, 3. Then Elijah released Virgil, stepped back, his whole body trembling. Take him, his voice was raw. Get him out of my sight. Sam moved forward, dragged the laughing killer away. Clara went to Elijah, wrapped her good arm around him. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. He held her, buried his face in her hair. Lily, he said brokenly, my little girl, I know. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 people holding each other in the darkness. Then a voice shattered the silence, very touching. Clara looked up. Marcus Weston stood at the end of the alley, a gun in his hand. Now, step away from my property, Elijah Stone. Clara and I have unfinished business. Clara felt Elijah's arms tighten around her. Let her go, Marcus. His voice was deadly calm. It's over. Your men are captured. Virgil is down. You have no one left. I have a gun. Marcus gestured with the weapon. And I'm an excellent shot. Better than you might think. Clara stepped forward. Elijah tried to hold her back, but she shook him off. You won't shoot me, Marcus. I am worth too much to you. Hurt you, maybe. Marcus smiled that poisonous smile. But Stone is expendable. He swung the gun toward Elijah. Clara moved without thinking, threw herself in front of the man she loved. The shot rang out. Pain exploded through her already injured shoulder. New wound layering over old. She went down hard. Clara. Elijah's voice seemed very far away. Then chaos. Elijah charging at Marcus, the gun firing again, missing, the 2 men colliding, rolling across the muddy street. Clara tried to rise. The world spun around her. She saw Elijah and Marcus struggling, saw the gun between them, saw fists flying. Elijah was bigger, stronger, But he was already wounded from earlier, already exhausted. Marcus fought dirty, fingers clawing at eyes, teeth biting at flesh. The gun went off again. Both men fell still. No. Clara dragged herself toward them. No, no, no. Then Elijah moved, pushed himself up. Marcus lay beneath him, not moving. Clara reached them, looked down at Marcus. The bullet had caught him in the chest. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. Is he? Clara could not finish the question. Dead. Elijah confirmed. He shot himself when we were fighting for the gun. Clara felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, just emptiness. It's over, she whispered. It's over. Elijah pulled her into his arms, careful of her wounds. I thought I lost you, he said. When you stepped in front of that bullet, you saved me first, all those weeks ago. She looked up at him. I was just returning the favor. He kissed her forehead. Let's get you to a doctor. They walked out of the alley together, into a town that was slowly coming back to life. Sam met them first, his face pale. Marcus dead. Yes, Elijah said, and Clara? She'll live. She needs a doctor, and about a month of rest. Clara managed a weak smile. I have never rested a day in my life. I'm not starting now, Sam laughed, despite everything. You're going to fit right in around here, Mrs. Stone. Mrs. Stone? Clara looked at Elijah. I like the sound of that. So do I. They were married 3 weeks later. A small ceremony in the Copper Creek Church. Clara wore a simple white dress that Martha had helped her sew. Wildflowers in her hair, her arm still in a sling from the healing wound. Elijah wore the nicest clothes he owned, which still did not quite fit his massive frame. Neither of them cared about perfection. They cared about each other. I take you, Clara Weston, Elijah said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes, to be my wife, to stand beside you in storms and sunshine, to protect you, not by hiding you away, but by fighting alongside you, to trust you with my past and build with you a future. I take you, Elijah Stone, Clara replied, to be my husband, to love you as you are, scars and shadows and all, to be your partner, not your burden, to remind you every day that you are worthy of love, and to let you remind me of the same. When they kissed, the church erupted in cheers. Later at the reception in Martha's boarding house, Sam made a toast to Elijah, who saved 12 women and called it just doing my job, to Clara, who stared down a rattlesnake in human form and did not blink, and to both of them together. May your happiness be as stubborn as your survival. Everyone drank. Clara laughed. Elijah smiled, really smiled. Worth it, he murmured in her ear. All of it, worth it for this. The next day they visited the hill under the old oak tree. 2 markers stood in the spring sunshine. Ruth Stone, beloved wife. Lily Stone, forever in our hearts. Clara had never been here before. The place felt sacred, full of old grief and older love. I never brought anyone here, Elijah said quietly. It felt wrong, like letting someone else into a place that was only hers. Do you want me to wait below? No, he took her hand. I want you here. I think she would want you here too. They stood before the graves, the spring wind tugging at Clara's dress, the mountains rising eternal around them. Ruth, Elijah said softly, I found someone. Someone brave and stubborn and too good for me. Just like you were. His voice cracked. He'll always love you. Both of you. But I've got room in my heart for more now. I hope you understand. Clara knelt, laid wildflowers on both graves. I never knew you, she told Ruth. But your journal showed me who you were. A woman who loved completely, who fought for her family, who died protecting her child. I hope to be half as brave. She touched the smaller marker gently. "And Lily, I'm sorry. So sorry that the world was cruel to someone so small and innocent. But your father's going to be okay now. I promise he'll take care of him." Elijah pulled her up, wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For letting me grieve and helping me live at the same time. I did not know that was possible." They stood together watching the clouds drift over the mountains. Two people who had found each other in the dark, who had fought through pain and loss and violence to reach this moment. "We're going to be all right," Clara said. "Yes," Elijah agreed. "We are." Spring came to Copper Creek like a promise the winter had tried to break but could not. The snow retreated up the mountain slopes. Wildflowers appeared beneath, columbines and lupines and larkspur, painting the valley in shades of purple and blue. The Yellowstone ran high and fast with meltwater, and the birds returned to fill the mornings with song. Clara stood on the porch of the cabin, her cabin now, truly hers, and breathed in air that tasted like beginnings. 3 months had passed since the night Marcus died. 3 months of healing, of building, of learning what it meant to have a home. Much had changed in that time. Marcus was buried in an unmarked grave outside of town. No one mourned him. Virgil Harding had been tried and convicted. Murder. Conspiracy. The list of charges went on and on. He would spend the rest of his life behind stone walls at the Montana Territorial Prison in Deer Lodge. Justice served at last. Sheriff Dalton had resigned, faced his own lesser charges for the bribes he had taken. A year in the county jail, maybe less, but enough to remind him that weakness had consequences. Jake had been promoted to sheriff, the youngest in the territory's history. He wore the badge with pride and honor. And Sam Whitehorse had moved to the ranch. His left arm never recovered from the bullet wound. He could no longer work the forge alone. But Elijah needed a partner, and Sam needed a home. The arrangement suited them both. Clara heard footsteps behind her. Then Elijah's arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder, thinking again, always, about what this time, about how different everything is. 3 months ago I was running for my life. Now, she leaned back into him. Now I have everything I never knew I wanted. Funny how that works. Very funny. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains. Elijah. There's something I need to tell you." He tensed slightly. "What is it?" Clara turned in his arms, looked up at his face. The face she loved, scars and all. "The doctor in Kansas said I could not have children. When I was married to Thomas, we tried, but nothing ever happened." "All right." Elijah's expression was careful, neutral. "But this morning," Clara took his hand, placed it on her belly, "I went to see the doctor in town. And it turns out," she smiled, "he was wrong." Elijah went very still. "You're 3 months along." Martha suspected. "She has seen enough pregnancies to know the signs." The doctor confirmed it. Silence. Long, heavy. Then Elijah kissed her, hard, deep, with everything he had. When they broke apart, his cheeks were wet with tears. But he was smiling, really smiling. "I told myself I did not want children," he said, "because I could not bear to lose another. But I was lying. I was just afraid. And now I am still afraid." His hand spread across her belly, protective, wondering. "But I'm not going to let fear steal any more of my life. Not when I have so much to live for." Clara felt tears of her own sliding down her cheeks. "I love you, Elijah Stone. I love you too, Clara Stone." They held each other as the spring wind blew warm around them, as the mountains stood watch, as the future opened up before them full of possibility. Later that day they told the others. Sam whooped with joy, lifted Clara off her feet before remembering her condition and setting her down with excessive care. Martha started planning. Baby clothes to be made, furniture to be built, advice to be given whether wanted or not. Jake rode out to congratulate them. Brought a bottle of whiskey for Elijah and flowers for Clara. By sunset, the whole town seemed to know. People Clara barely recognized stopped to wish her well, to shake Elijah's hand, to offer predictions about whether it would be a boy or a girl. The devil of Copper Creek had become something else entirely. A man worth knowing, a neighbor worth having, a friend. That night, Clara and Elijah sat before the fire. The same spot where she had first seen him weeping over a child's bonnet. The same spot where they had shared their secrets, their fears, their hopes. "What should we name the baby?" Clara asked. "If it's a girl, it's a—" Elijah was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to name her Ruth, after her mother, and Lily. For the sister, she will never know. Ruth Lily Stone." Clara smiled. "It's beautiful. And if it's a boy, then we name him Thomas, after the man who saved you, who sent you to me even in death. Thomas Stone." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. He would have liked that. Elijah pulled her closer. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For everything. For falling through my door. For refusing to give up on me. For loving me when I did not know how to love myself." Clara pressed her lips to his. "You are worth loving, Elijah Stone. Never forget that." "I won't," he promised. "Not anymore." Outside, the wind whispered through the new grass. The stars emerged one by one, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled at the rising moon. Inside the cabin that had once been cold and empty, two people held each other close, dreaming of the life they would build together, a life full of hope and healing and love. And 1 year later, laughter. The sound drifted across the valley like music, bright and innocent and impossibly precious. Elijah Stone stood at the edge of his property, watching his wife chase a giggling toddler across the spring grass, and felt his heart crack wide open. He had forgotten what joy sounded like. Or maybe he had never really known. He knew now. The ranch had grown in the past year. New barn, expanded cabin, thriving cattle operation. But those were just buildings, just numbers. What mattered was the life inside them. Ruth Lily Stone, named for the ones they had lost. A miracle neither of them had dared to hope for. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. She was curious about everything, afraid of nothing, already trying to walk at 10 months old. "She's got your stubbornness." Sam called from the porch. He sat in the rocking chair, whittling a wooden horse one-handed, his damaged arm resting useless in his lap, and her father's lungs. Clara laughed as Ruth Lily shrieked with delight. "This child never stops making noise." Good. House was too quiet before. Elijah walked up the path, dusty from a day checking fence lines. Ruth Lily spotted him immediately, changed course, barreled toward him on unsteady legs. "Da, da." He scooped her up, swung her into the air until she squealed, then settled her against his chest. Her tiny fist closed around his finger. "Hello, little one. Were you good for your mother? Number?" Clara arrived breathless. She tried to eat a butterfly. "That's my girl. Don't encourage her." But Clara was smiling, and so was he. And Ruth Lily was babbling happily about nothing at all. This, Elijah thought, this is what I almost lost, what I almost threw away because I was too afraid to hope. That evening, after Ruth Lily was asleep, Clara and Elijah sat before the fire. The same place they had sat so many times before, but different now, fuller. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Clara asked. "When I stumbled through your door, I said I was going to devour you whole. You did." She smiled, just not the way either of us expected. He pulled her closer. "Regrets? Not a single one. Silence." comfortable, full. "I dreamed about Ruth last night," Elijah said quietly. First time in months that it was not a nightmare. She was smiling, holding Lily, our first Lily, and she looked at me and said, "It's okay, Eli. I'm okay. We're okay." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Maybe she was saying goodbye. Maybe. Or maybe she was saying thank you. He kissed her forehead for loving me back to life. Morning came soft and golden, sunrise over the mountains. The family gathered on the porch, Elijah, Clara, Ruth Lily on her father's lap, Sam drinking coffee nearby. The light spilled over the valley like honey, warming the cabin's worn wood, gilding the wildflowers in the meadow. A stranger passing by would see a simple scene, a rancher with his wife and child, an old friend sharing morning coffee, a home carved from wilderness by stubborn hands and stubborner hearts. They would not know that the rancher had once been called the Devil of Copper Creek. They would not know that the wife had nearly died running from a monster in a gentleman's coat. They would not know that the old man had given his arm for his friends, or that the child's name carried the weight of lives lost and love found. They would not know any of that, and that was fine, because some stories are not meant to be known. They are meant to be lived. Elijah Stone lifted his daughter high enough to catch the morning light. She laughed as though the world was full of nothing but wonder. Maybe it was. Maybe sometimes, if you are brave enough to believe in impossible things, the world has a way of proving you right. Clara leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Happy?" she asked. "More than I ever thought possible." "Good," she kissed his cheek. "Me too." The mountains stood eternal around them, silent witnesses to the small, fierce miracle of two broken people who had found their way home to each other. And in the valley below, where the winter storms had once raged, spring bloomed wild and free and unstoppable. Clara thought of that night so long ago, stumbling through a blizzard with one bullet saved for herself, thinking she was going to die. She had not died. She had lived, found love in the most unlikely place, built a family from the ruins of grief. And it had all started with a door opening, with a giant catching her as she fell, with words that had terrified her until she understood their meaning. "I'm gonna devour you whole tonight." He had, just not the way she expected, and she was grateful, every single day, for the storm that had brought her to him, for the courage that had kept her there, for the love that had healed them both. This was home, not the cabin, not the land, but this feeling of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be. Clara looked at her husband, at her daughter, at Sam, who had become family, at the life they had built from nothing but hope and stubbornness. And she smiled, because sometimes the best stories have happy endings, and this one did. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.